All right. Welcome to Informed Saints. Today, Elder Gérald Caussé was sustained as the newest apostle of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And we're going to talk about what we think this means for his future ministry and even for the church, the future of the church, because every time there's a new apostle, there's a shift in that dynamic and what the future of the church may hold. So I'm really excited. This was a surprise for me when I first heard the news. What was your guys' reaction?
Well, I was with our friend Matt Roper, visiting him, talking about some research and stuff. And I looked out at my phone and I saw the headline from the church newsroom. And I was like, oh, we have a new apostle. And I showed it to Matt. And as soon as I saw Gérald Caussé, I was like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. Like, presiding bishop, he's been a presence at General Conference, has a lot of competency with church finances and stuff. So I was like, oh, that's awesome. He's a cool guy. So we got a French apostle. Groovy. Yeah, it was great.
I wouldn't say that I was expecting Bishop Caussé, now Elder Caussé, I suppose. But he was definitely someone who crossed my mind when thinking about who the next apostle might be. So I would say he was on the list, I guess. He was on my list. Whether someone's on my list or not really doesn't matter. But but he's someone that
I clarify that. I mean, it's always fun to like talk in armchair quarterback when it comes to the church. But the reality is, like, this is all by revelation. They pray about this really hard.
Of course,
our opinions do not matter at all.
Of course, absolutely. But yeah, he was someone who had crossed my mind when thinking about what the possibilities were, and so I wasn't surprised by it when I heard the news. It was well within expectations, I should say.
I guess it is a little bit. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Jasmin. I didn't want to.
I was somewhat surprised, mostly just because I don't typically think of like the presiding bishop as going into the Quorum of the 12. But then I was surprised to learn that Elder Stevenson had been the presiding bishop before he was called to the 12. I don't know why I didn't remember that or didn't think about that. I was looking at the list of like presiding bishops from the past years, I saw oh, there actually are quite a few presiding bishops who eventually like went into the Quorum of the 12 after that. So I guess there is some precedence there, and it makes somewhat sense because the presiding bishop, his role is to oversee the temporal affairs of the church. That includes things like tithing, church finances, budgeting, welfare, humanitarian aid, charitable giving, things that I personally don't consider. I mean, it's not my strength. Finances has never been my strength, but so I don't necessarily think of that as just like, it's more the unglamorous side of the church, I guess I should say. But it makes a lot of sense that in the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, it would be very helpful to have someone with a lot of experience in managing the church's temporal affairs. So I thought that made a lot of sense. Neal, what were you going to say?
Well, I was just going to say that was one of the, I didn't remember Elder Stevenson having previously been the presiding bishop either. And that was one of the things I wondered about. I didn't have time to look it up, so I'd be curious if you have a list. How many people from the presiding bishopric have become apostles, and who are some of the people? Like, are there names I would recognize besides Elder Stevenson?
Would you recognize Orson F. Whitney, Neal? You should know.
Well, yes, I know Orson F. Whitney.
Okay, so Charles W. Nibley. Do you have a list?
I just looked on Wikipedia. Yeah, I'll share my screen. Let's see. And there were a few names I recognized. Of course, Elder Stevenson being the foremost one. So, presiding bishop on Wikipedia. Here's the list. Obviously, we've got the first and most famous, Edward Partridge, being the first bishop. But as you go through, I mean, I don't know very many of the older Quorum of the 12 Apostles. I think Charles Nibley maybe was an apostle. I don't know.
Well, yeah,
but LeGrand Richards, he was an apostle, right? Okay.
Yeah, LeGrand Richards, yeah, he becomes an apostle. He writes A Marvelous Work and a Wonder. He famously is the apostle.
And then Robert D. Hales.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah. Robert Hales, I remember him.
And then Gary E. Stevenson and Gérald Caussé.
Merrill J. Bateman is someone that I remember when I was younger thinking might be an apostle at some point, but that obviously never came to fruition. I think, if I'm remembering correctly, he actually went from presiding bishopric to BYU president in that order.
Ah, okay, that's why his name's familiar. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, President Bateman of
Um,
BYU back in the 90s.
But yeah, the other thing I thought, I wasn't sure how old Elder Caussé is, but I thought he was older than he is. So finding out that he's 62, I think that does make him maybe the youngest in the Quorum of the 12 at this point. I'm not 100% sure. I know Elder Kieran is 64. And so I think at 62 he is the youngest member, not just the newest member, but the youngest member of the Quorum of the 12. But
Let's see, I'm looking up right here. Ulysses Suarez he's 67. Elder Gong 71. Yeah, I think he might be the youngest.
Yeah.
Elder Renlund 72. Elder Stevenson is 70. Everybody else is in their 70s. Yeah.
Yeah. So he is the youngest.
I remember when like Dieter F. Uchtdorf and Elder Bednar were called, like they both seemed like pretty young apostles at the time when they were called, but I think they both were also in their 60s.
I think Elder Bednar was in his 50s when he was called.
Okay,
if
maybe you're right.
if he's in his 70s now,
Yeah.
that was 21 years ago, so he would be in his 50s then.
Okay, I
He
have
was
a website
52
here.
at the time.
I have a handy website here that shows age at their call to the 12 and their current age. So Elder Oaks was called at 51. Elder Holland at 53. Elder Eyring at 61. So a little jump there. Elder Uchtdorf 63. Elder Bednar 52. Yep, as Neal was saying.
There
Elder
you go.
Cook,
I mean, you get the
67.
gist. So he's
Yeah.
probably like well within average, I suppose, of being called.
He's
to
well
the 12.
within the normal age. I think part of what made me think he was older than he was is one, I feel like he's had that white gray hair for a long time. But he also has been in the ranks of general authority for a long time. He was general authority 70 starting in 2008. And he would have just been 45 at the time, which is amazing. I'd be curious to know, we don't need to look it up, but I'd be curious to know how many 70s are in their 40s, because that feels way too close to my own age, if I'm being perfectly frank. But yeah, he was a little younger than I thought he was. Given how long he's been around as a general authority or general officer of the church, I thought he was maybe a little older, and so that was another thought that I had. This is just, again, what I'm thinking or expecting of the next apostle means absolutely nothing, so who cares? But since you guys are all listening to me, I get to talk about stuff. I was expecting or maybe hoping, I don't know, that the next apostle would be someone in their 50s, as we just saw does happen on a number of occasions. Because if that were the case, it would have marked the first member of Generation X called into the apostleship. And that kind of would have been interesting, because right now they're all silent generation or baby boomers. So I will say I do think probably, I don't know if I want to say the next apostle, who knows how soon that's going to come, but I think probably in the next 2 or 3 years, if there's a vacancy, we may see our first Generation X apostle next. But we'll see. But that, anyway, those are some of my initial thoughts when I saw the call, that it was Elder Caussé. Yeah.
Well, I think that's great. One of the things that I'm looking forward to, so as I was learning a little bit more about Bishop Caussé, I've personally really enjoyed his conference talks. I've enjoyed learning more about him, especially through the Religious Studies Center, because he's published with them a couple times, mostly because he's spoken at some of their conferences. And so I remember in 2019 when the church scandal broke out about the church's finances. The SEC is fining the church for these massive, tax evasion, and there was a whistleblower about how large the church's portfolio was. Obviously, the finances of the church came to the forefront in a way they never really had before. And it was during that time that I wanted to learn more about church finances and the history of that and how they're operated. And so I found some articles in the Religious Studies Center from Bishop Caussé explaining a little bit more about how church finances work. And so I'm not saying that, I'm not going to pigeonhole Bishop Caussé as the finance guy, and so he's going to really harp on that in General Conference. obviously he's going to be led by inspiration for the topics like he's going to cover in general conference and what's going to be the highlights of his ministry. And I think the most important thing that he is known for is just that fact that he has a strong testimony of Jesus Christ, and he loves testifying of the Savior. But nonetheless, I think he brings a lot of experience to the table in this aspect because he's spent a decade as the presiding bishop. And even before that, he was a counselor in the Presiding Bishopric. So he has had a lot of experience learning how to administer the church's finances, learning how to administer financial or humanitarian aid, charitable giving. And those are massive operations. I was surprised to learn that during Bishop Caussé's leadership, charitable giving and humanitarian aid had increased to about $1 billion per year. And it is impossible for me as a human being to really quantify and conceptualize how big that number is, but it is huge. And it was a massive increase from what the church was doing before. And people can speculate for all sorts of reasons why that increase happened, but I think it's remarkable and commendable that the church has been increasing their humanitarian aid, their charitable giving, and really investing a lot in it. So as I was learning more about how the church does their finances, I'm not an expert on this by any stretch, but I was interested to learn that the church very diligently sticks to certain principles when it comes to administering their finances. When you think about church finances, you tend to think of it as like, oh, the corporation of the church, and everything is done in this very clinical and analytical way. And absolutely, when it comes to administering like large amounts of resources, like we've got to be really careful and have the top tier accountants and making sure everything is done responsibly and well. But on top of that, there are spiritual principles that guide church finances. And I thought it was interesting to learn about from Bishop Caussé. So in the Business and Religion Conference at the Religious Studies Center, this was the 2018 Church History Symposium. So this was just a year before like the whistleblower news broke. They had a conference on business and religion, the intersection of faith and finance. And Bishop Caussé gave the keynote address, In the Lord's Way, the Spiritual Foundations, there it goes, of church financial self-reliance. And I was pretty touched just reading all of this. And it was fascinating too, because this is an aspect of the church that I knew a lot less about, and that the church doesn't necessarily make super public because, it's just a lot of minutia when it comes to balancing budgets. But the 4 principles that he taught about how the church manages its money is, first, the law of tithing. And this is not like a church rule. This is scripture. This is a commandment the Lord has given for ever since the Restoration was founded, and there's even biblical precedent to this concept. And when the prophet first arrived in Missouri in 1838, they were trying to build a new temple, and the finances were tight, and the church was in debt. And in response, the Lord gave Section 119 of the Doctrine and Covenants. So up to this point in Kirtland, they've been trying to introduce the law of consecration as through the United Order, this idea that you would consecrate your properties and the bishop would redistribute according to your needs and your stewardships. But then in D&C 119, he introduces the law of tithing, and that you shall pay 1/10 of your interest annually, or your increase annually. And people have interpreted that in different ways, but it has scriptural roots. And Bishop Caussé says, to this day, the church abides by the law of tithing, that we receive resources from the members of the church who offer their money in order to build up the kingdom of God. And so they take that very, very careful, it is a heavy burden, and they want to make sure that they use those funds wisely. And so they pray over how to do all of this. In fact, I think he said that it's the first Wednesday or maybe the first Friday in December is kind of the set day that the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, the Presiding Bishopric meet. Yeah, the first Friday in December. And that's when they decide how they're going to use the tithing for the year. That's like their big budget meeting. And I assume before that, they have lots of pre-meetings to kind of decide, make proposals, and figure out where the greatest needs are. But it's the first Friday in December that they officially allocate how the tithing funds are going to be used for the following year. And they make sure it's done prayerfully.
So does that mean they only have about a month to put a new presiding bishop in place so that that can go well?
Oh man.
Ooh, that's a good question.
No pressure.
I don't know.
That is something that I had not actually thought of until you were talking about this, but there's a little bit of a domino effect here. I feel like when they call an apostle out of the 70, for instance, there's not quite the urgency to like replace them because there's a lot of 70, right? But like you've got to have a presiding bishop, and so now like how long do they wait before the new presiding bishop's called? I don't know.
Well, I will say, first of all, I think we probably underappreciate the responsibilities that other 70 probably have in their various capacities. I mean, like if you're the managing director or if you're the executive director of the missionary department as a 70 and then you're called to the apostleship, like that's a pretty big responsibility to just like hand off. So I imagine there's probably a transition period. Same with like the communications department or whatever department a general authority might be over. Like that's huge. And I imagine all 70 are very busy. But I remember we learned with President Oaks that he was called as an apostle when we were reading his biography to prepare for our interview with Rick Turley. He was called as an apostle, but he couldn't like take on the assignment right away, right? He had to, there was like a time period before he had to wrap up his legal commitments before being able to actually take on the assignment of the apostleship.
Yes, he had to wait. They had, I think it ended up being like 6 weeks or something like that, but he had to wait to finish up with some, rendering some opinions on some cases that he didn't want to be perceived as tainted, as people perceive him as acting as a church official or something in those, and therefore tainting or biasing the opinions. So, yeah, there was that. And I certainly didn't mean to imply that like the 70s aren't doing important work and they aren't very busy. But the quorum of the 70, unlike the quorum of the 12, does not maintain a constant number of 70 people in it. And so there's not like a vacancy created per se when a person from the 70 is called up into the apostleship, because there's the exact number that end up being in the 70s quorums does fluctuate based on various needs. So, it's maybe easier to shuffle some things around when you pull someone up from the 70, whereas like there's I wouldn't say a single point of failure, but like the presiding bishop is a more specific and distinctive position that needs to be like filled. You can't just have a vacancy there. Anyway, Stephen, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to add, in this day and age as well, the church's finances are being so heavily scrutinized, right? Like, it seems like no matter what the church does, you're going to get lots of people online scrutinizing its finances and getting mad about it. And so, I can imagine that the presiding bishopric is in some ways under a lot of scrutiny for this. I'm thinking of I think it was 60 Minutes did that little review interviewing W. Christopher Waddell, Bishop Waddell, right? Where they kind of grilled him on church finances and that, that's like national news, basically national headline news. And so, yeah, we don't want to undersell the important role that the 70 play, but I imagine, well, I'm just imagining, I don't really know, but I imagine that maybe there's extra scrutiny, or at least they feel an extra burden, the presiding bishopric, given the amount of scrutiny the church finances is going through these days.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So the second principle that, according to Bishop Caussé, the church abides by is this idea of self-reliance and independence. And this is not just like good advice for the church. This is good advice for anyone. And this really is a foundational principle when it comes to how the church hopes its members operate, because they're all about, you don't want to be reliant on like church welfare. We want members of the church to learn how to provide for themselves, give them skills for human flourishing, to be able to feel accomplished and proud of themselves, and give them that dignity by being able to support themselves, provide for themselves, and live within their means. And the church operates by that exact same principle. And he says that the two principles they operate on when it comes to that is, or the policies they operate on when it comes to that principle is, first, total expenditures will not exceed forecasted revenue. And second, the budget for operating expenses will not increase year to year at a more rapid rate than the anticipated growth in tithing contributions. So basically, they live within their budget. They say, okay, this is the revenue we have for this year. Our expenditures are not going to exceed that. And when we're trying to forecast next year, we need to make sure we're within what our projected revenue sources are going to be. And I think that's very wise, and that's increasingly rare. So many for-profit businesses will very easily either go into debt or make gambles, essentially, by borrowing money in order to make things happen. The church has gone through lots of periods of financial struggle and debt and creditors and loans, and now they're in a position where they have decided we are going to be very fiscally tight when it comes to operations. We are not going to spend more than we have. And I mean, that's common sense.
Yeah, I think it's in Saints Volume 3 that has stories of like how Heber J. Grant assumed the burden of like, hey, the church is going to explode financially. And if you do something, good luck, Heber J. Grant, go figure it out, right? And there's these miraculous stories of him at the last minute finding some sort of salvation, financial salvation for the church. I don't often recommend the work of D. Michael Quinn because I think that his stuff on many levels is problematic. But I do think that Volume 3 of his The Mormon Hierarchy series, which is on church finances, it may be one of the better things that he did. It's really interesting, actually, how he goes through the history of church finances. And he famously said in an interview with the Salt Lake Tribune when his book came out, that like it's basically a faith promoting story by any measure, how the church went from like on the brink of total financial insolvency to like being one of the richest churches in the world, right? Like it's an amazing success story by any metric. And I've heard anecdotally that his work on that book and him having a very glowing and positive sort of narrative or positive findings about the church's finances did not win him a lot of friends among the Sunstone ex-Mormon crowd, right? Who were excitedly waiting for the tell-all expose of how, they're embezzling all the money. And in fact, D. Michael Quinn's work shows like, no, they're actually very good and responsible, and they've like come off the brink of financial ruin, and that's an inspiring and good thing they've done.
Yeah, I remember, there absolutely was some anticipation or expectation that it was going to be some kind of expose about how dirty church finances are. But yeah, he ended up being, he himself said it's a very faith-promoting, inspiring story. And there was kind of fallout there. People were pretty unhappy about it. Instead of maybe reconsidering their own assumptions, right? Maybe I was wrong. It was they were mad. He suddenly was an apologist again.
Yeah. Funny how that works, right? Well, to Jasmin's point, we can just say here, this is kind of interesting. These policies include 2 simple principles, which I like to read to you. So this seems to be like Jasmin said, we're getting a glimpse inside the leading philosophy of church financial practice. Total expenditures will not exceed forecasted revenue. The budget for operating expenses will not increase year to year at a more rapid rate than the anticipated growth in tithing contributions. It seems like they learned that lesson the hard way from some of the history that you can read about, where they did not follow those very smart principles, some previous church leaders, not to necessarily criticize or fault them per se, but rather to acknowledge
We've come a long
way. The frailty and the mistakes we make along the way of dealing with something as volatile as finances, right? Or how that can be volatile.
Well, and the beauty of like learning those hard lessons and having to like it's not glamorous, and it often doesn't feel spiritual to be delving into finances, but the purpose is to bless lives, to bless God's children. And we do that spiritually through, building the kingdom, but then also through that humanitarian aid, that charitable giving. It's because we've been so wise with our funds that we're now able to give back and bless the world through charitable giving, but more importantly, spiritually. Like, we believe that the purpose of the church is not charity. The purpose of the church is to save souls, and we believe that itself is the greatest work that anyone can be doing. Neal, did you have something to say?
Well, I was just going to say that in regards to people who criticize the church for not spending more on humanitarian aid and welfare support and things like that, I mean, this kind of answers that to some level, right? People are like, oh, the church could afford to do more. Well, maybe it could, but they're trying to find, they're trying, like, even though they have lots of money, that doesn't mean they shouldn't still follow sound financial principles. And in fact,
Yeah.
if you don't follow sound financial principles, you can quickly find that having, like, you go from having lots of money to not very much, right? Because money can go faster than you think it can. And so you have to, even as like your wealth increases, you have, not that I know much about being wealthy, but you have to still follow sound budget practices and things like that if you want to stay, stay
Yeah.
financially solvent and stable. And so the church is determined to do that no matter how much people like want to push them to spend more and things like that. And you want to see the church increase its budgets. Well, pay more, more tithing and make
Pay
more
more
donations
tithing.
to the church, because
Based.
it's gonna directly be directly connected to how much they their anticipated growth in contributions, right? Like you said. So that's one thing. But I think another point to be made here is that I thought of a little earlier, but people attach that dollar amount. They look at the dollar amount of what the church gives, and that's kind of what they attach to what the church is doing to help people. But the way the church teaches self-reliance and teaches sound principles of financial management and things like that, and helps educate people on how to manage a budget and how to actually go from being dependent and using welfare to becoming financially independent. That is an underrated contribution to like the betterment of the poor, if you will. That is not as easily accounted for in like the line item budget, right? In the total dollar amount spent. And in fact, if it's being done right, it means you're spending less money on the long run. And so it can give people the wrong impression. Like, people want to see a bigger and bigger number of dollars spent to help people, but really that on some level, if that can be an indication, if your expenditure is increasing but the number of people that are being helped does not go up, or you're not getting more efficient with that spending, that's actually not a good sign that your welfare programs and humanitarian aid are being very effective. And the church is like these principles that the church teaches about good financial practice. It's very much about not just spending money on humanitarian welfare aid, but doing it in a way that's effective and going to have an impact.
Sustainable and long
Yeah.
term. Yeah, so I have a sister who works in nonprofit, NGO work, right, charitable work. And I'm not an expert like she is, but I've seen enough of how the sausage is made in a lot of these things. She's kind of taught me some of the, call it the trade secrets if you want. And basically it kind of boils down to a lot of people have this idea that I give $10 to the charity of my choice, and I expect that the charity just turns around and immediately gives that $10 to the cause, whatever it is, right? Feeding homeless people or whatever. That's a really good way of maybe having a one-time short-term impact for the cause you want to support, and then you have to close the doors because you have no more money left, right? Like, there's actually a lot of work, that, like financial background work, that goes into making the charity work for its intended purpose. And my sister even helped produce a documentary basically arguing, and I'm going to kind of butcher it, but the basic point was that charities should actually act more like for-profit organizations and corporations in terms of like how they do their finances, and like being okay with that. Not in terms of they're trying to get a profit, obviously, but like how they structure their finances to like be long-term self-sustaining. They should probably follow that model to some degree. And again, that's kind of, icky, gross, right? But if you want your charitable money to go to the cause you want it to, on the long term, have it be sustainable, have it actually have an impact, you can't just throw money at people, in other words. And a lot of the people, I think, a lot of people don't understand that, or they misunderstand how this kind of works. So I don't know. Long and short of it is, I'm not a financial expert either. I mean, I've dabbled in some of the stuff that's published on this, or some insider baseball people have told me how this kind of works. Church seems doing pretty good so far. I mean, you know, when that whistleblower came out and blew the lid off that that number, it's like, oh, that's pretty good, all things considered. And there doesn't seem to be any sign of anything evil or corrupt happening. There also doesn't seem to be any indication that they're hurting financially. So I don't know. They seem to be doing something right.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Well, should we tackle these other two principles here real quick?
Sure thing. Yeah, let's do it.
Provident living and in the Lord's own way. So he talks about provident living. I think this is basically the idea of you need to hope for the best, but prepare for the worst kind of idea, right? And so we can kind of read here. He mentions Brigham Young and Richard Quarters having the responsibility of all these saints he had to care for. And we have section 136 of the Doctrine and Covenants, so principles of organization that would govern the exodus of the pioneers. He then quotes from section 136, each company provide themselves with teams and wagons and provisions and so forth, and how this was important for the migration. So using the example of the Exodus and people living providently and preparing for times of calamity or times of emergency, he then pivots, Elder Caussé pivots and says, church members are conscious of the fact that they live in a period of calamities caused by both human actions and the furies of nature, right? Talks about prophecies, about all this bad stuff going to happen. The church have counseled members to practice provident living by establishing home storage, including extra water, food, medicine, and so forth. The same principle of temporal preparation has been applied at the general church level. So we're getting into like the farms and the grain storehouses and the bishop storehouses and all that kind of stuff. The church methodically follows the practice of setting aside a portion of its revenues each year to prepare for any possible future needs. I guess the principle here is like the 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine, right? From Joseph of Egypt. And again, like that makes sense. Like if you just turn around immediately and just throw all your money at whatever charitable cause, which may be a noble, I'm not criticizing the cause necessarily, right? But that can lead to all sorts of problems in the long term if you're not prepared for issues that come up, financial issues. I mean, what if we have another Great Depression?
The big thing here
we wake up tomorrow, right?
People...
Or a calamity or something. Oh, go ahead, Jasmin.
Well, I think the big principle here is that a lot of people make a big deal about the church having this massive savings. The fact that they have just this insane stock portfolio. It's like, well, what on earth do they need that much money for in savings? And it's because like that's just a principle of the gospel that the Lord has asked members of the church to not just like live within your means, but to save for the future. Do food storage. You never know when you're going to need that. And so the church lives by the same rules it asks its members to. And so, I mean, I think Aaron Miller, he's a finance professor at BYU, and he even talked about how like, okay, that this is a very large portfolio in savings, but even if you consider the worldwide membership of the church, 17 plus million people, that would last the operations of the church like maybe a dozen years. Like it really isn't that huge in the long run. And so people who are concerned about like, why does the church have that much money? It's because they have a large operation. They have a huge organization and a world to minister to. And so I think it's a valid principle that Bishop Caussé teaches about, you know, we need to save money. We need to prepare for the future.
And I want to note, some people, when they talk about the church's wealth, they want to take all the investments, but then they also want to add on to it, like, you know, land that the church owns and, you know, property like the church buildings and all this stuff, real estate assets. And, you know, so they come up with this even, you know, there's this ginormous number of like the church's overall wealth and what it's worth. And it's like, yes, the church owns all of this land and that has a dollar value that you can attach to it. But as I think it was Elder Bednar pointed out in an interview once, those are assets that are costing the church money. They have to maintain the church buildings. You know, they have to maintain their ranches and whatever else they have, you know, land on. They have to pay taxes on land that they own. Those are not like liquid assets that the church can use for various resources. Those are things that are draining church resources And, you know, if, like you said, if the church just stopped making money or whatever, the reason that the investment portfolio would only last a dozen years or so is because you've got all this property to manage and all these overhead costs that running the church is, and it's like an $8 or $9 billion annual expense to just run the church. And so, yeah, the money, like I said earlier, when you don't follow sound financial practices, I think you find that even large sums of money can go really fast, and it can surprise you. So
the last principle that Bishop Caussé taught in this conference address was that to do it in the Lord's way. And there's a great anecdote where he talks about when he was first called as a general authority. Bishop Gérald Caussé went to President Packer's office. Elder Boyd K. Packer told him to come to his office and meet with him. And all he did was took out a piece of paper, asked him to read what was on the paper out loud, and it was a scripture in 1 Corinthians 2:5. And that was all he said. And then he dismissed me without further comment. Like, can you imagine how awkward and strange that encounter would have been? He goes back to his office and kind of like rereads it and tried to process it. And the scripture is 1 Corinthians 2, verse 5, and it's that your faith shall not stand in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. And certainly you can see how that wisdom would apply to spiritual matters. But Bishop Caussé was in over the temporal affairs of the church in the presiding bishopric, and he took that very much to heart. He said that this like really came to the forefront when he was finally assigned to be in the presiding bishopric, because even though it's temporal affairs, even though it's pencil pushing and, you know, tallying up numbers and trying to balance accounts, and you would think it is just mundane, it is secular, it is clinical. The reality is everything, every operation of the church is supposed to be spiritual in nature. And so he really does take that to heart. And when the decisions are made, they're done with prayer, they're done through revelation, they're done through thinking through things very, very carefully, because these are sacred funds, and this is a sacred work God's called us to do. And so I just thought this was a fascinating, just like under the hood look at how church finances operate, because we don't often get very much insight into that. And Bishop Caussé has had a decade of experience. And so it was a cool conference address to kind of highlight that. And I do think he's bringing all of that with him into the Quorum of the 12 Apostles now. Any other thoughts on finances before we go into other Caussé things?
Well, I was just going to say, while we're on this paper, in the introduction to this paper, he actually talks about how hard he finds it to describe his responsibilities in the presiding bishopric to non-Latter-day Saint friends who might ask, you know, what do you do? And like, you know, stuff like that. And he says, this isn't how he describes it, but he does say it would be convenient to simply reply to that my counselors and I constitute the executive directors of a worldwide organization. And then he goes off and, you know, he talks about all the ways what he does as the presiding bishop is similar to the role that, you know, an executive director would play in running a major corporation or organization like this. And I think that does provide maybe some insight as to like what kind of skill set he's bringing to the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. And again, I think this is something we don't appreciate all the time about the presiding bishopric as a particularly unique position within the church. But there's kind of a lot of like, you know, executive kind of experience. And in managing not only a large financial portfolio, but scaling operations, because like you mentioned, you know, things like our humanitarian operations stuff have grown expansively in the time he's been in the bishopric. And he's been responsible for figuring out, how do we scale this? How do we use these additional funds in ways that are going to be efficient and responsible? And those are all skills that I think become very helpful when you're in the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, and you have even more responsibility for overseeing the entire operations of this this global church. And it reminds me of actually President Oaks when we talked to Rick Turley. Go check out our interview with Rick Turley if you haven't, by the way. And we talked a little bit about how President Oaks and Elder Holland, or President Holland now, but it was Elder Oaks and Elder Holland at the time, had to go serve in the presidencies of foreign area presidencies for a while while apostles, because the church was struggling to figure out how to, as the church was growing in those regions, the church was struggling to figure out how to retain and kind of scale their operations, if you will, to maintain activity and have like all the priesthood support you needed for the growth and things like that. And so they needed apostles on the ground to help them figure out, okay, how do we do this? This is something that, so that's a skill set. What I'm trying to suggest is that I can see how this might be a skill set that someone like President Oaks would appreciate and value as the church is growing as an organization, and not just growing financially, but growing in terms of converts and people and things like that. You've got to understand how to grow the church in specific areas in ways that can scale and be sustainable. And that's something that would have been well within the purview of his responsibilities as the presiding bishop.
No, that's
well
well
on
said.
That point, speaking about bringing it to scale, are we done with this article? Can I put this away real quick?
Sure,
so
absolutely.
Let me share something else here now, if I may.
Sure.
Just a second.
I also think that one of the cool things about Bishop Caussé is that it's making an increasingly international Quorum of the 12 Apostles. We have had, in the early days of the church, we had a lot of members of the Quorum of the 12 from like England and Wales, but we have not had this much of an international Quorum of the 12 Apostles probably since then. With Elder Caussé from France, we have, and here we're going into international stuff, and then Elder, Kieran from England, and we've got Elder Suarez from Brazil. It is starting to become a very, very international Quorum of the 12 Apostles, and I love it. And I think this is probably the direction the church needs to head as we become more global.
Yeah, look at this. So this is Francophone Africa, and the church's growth, some of the largest in the world, is happening here in this part of the world. So makes a lot of sense to have a French-speaking apostle overlooking and sort of presiding over this. Well, I shouldn't say presiding per se, because we're not sure exactly. But I can imagine, or I can sort of perhaps anticipate where Elder Caussé will have his supervision in the future as an apostle, right? I think a lot of it's going to be here in this part of the world, which I find very interesting.
The other thing that I find pretty interesting about Bishop Caussé is the fact that he has highlighted environmentalism a little bit in his ministry, which I think is an underappreciated aspect that we don't hear a ton in General Conference, but his last conference talk was about, like, we're stewards of the earth. We need to take care of God's creations. It's a way we can show God that we care about them. And I think part of that is coming from his experience in the Presiding Bishopric as well, because part of the temporal affairs of the church is, for example, like taking care of the facilities maintenance of church buildings, I believe. I could be wrong about that. But it was not too long ago that the church announced that they were going to implement some more like water conscious measures when it comes to the care of their lawns and the facilities management to make sure that they could conserve even more water, especially during times of drought. And so, environmental sustainability in church operations like this, I believe, is under the purview of the Presiding Bishopric.
Yeah. By the way, that's BOU Hawaii. I'm pretty sure that I've been there before. This is the parking lot, and it's kind of clever that they are covering it up with solar panels. That's pretty good.
Yeah.
Yeah, look at that.
It makes sense. And so through his experience, it sounds like he's gained an even greater appreciation for the fact that this is God's earth. We need to do what we can to not just preserve it, but also replenish it and to make sure that we are being good stewards of the earth. And I think that's a wonderful lesson. I know sometimes environmentalism can feel like a politically polarizing topic, but the reality is, like, it is a gospel principle, and so that's something we all can get behind, and then we can argue about specifics of how we do it, I suppose, when it comes to government policy.
Well, and that's exactly right. I think whatever's going on in the government sphere, in the public sphere, private institutions, I hope everybody could agree that private institutions can and should rightly be taking their own initiative towards environmental work and environmental stewardship, right? I'm actually really happy that the church is doing this right now, and it's not because I'm some bleeding heart liberal or whatever, but it's because I think we have a scriptural mandate to do this. Genesis chapter 1, when God gives dominion over the whole earth to the man and the woman, or to man that He created in His image, right, male and female, I would argue that dominion, as it's translated in the Hebrew, to rule over, to radah, right? That includes stewardship over these things that God has made for them. And the whole, I mean, you could extrapolate this when he puts them in the garden and he says, tend to the garden, take good care of it, right? I have always interpreted that as, on sort of the allegorical level, as a commandment to care for the earth. Imagine us as being in the Garden of Eden, as it were, right, on this earth that God has made for us. And we have a responsibility to look out for the natural resources we have. And Hugh Nibley, of course, has a wonderful chapter in his book about Brigham Young called Brother Brigham Challenges the Saints, I think is the name of the book. And he has an article on Brigham Young and the environment. And Brigham Young was an environmentalist by any reasonable definition, in the sense that Brigham Young challenge the saints and encourage the saints to care for the natural resources they have. So I think that this is wonderful, this environmental initiative that the church has adopted. Look at this: adopt renewable energy, improve energy efficiency, conserve water. I think it's great that the church, look at this, has donated tens of thousands of feet of water to protect the Great Salt Lake and all this sort of stuff, right? Recycle, reuse, avoid material waste, right? Like this is all fantastic. And it just keeps going on and on. And so God bless Bishop Caussé, and not just him alone, it's many others, but he's kind of been one of the public-facing figures leading this charge as the presiding bishop to oversee the environmental work the church is doing.
Well, I agree. I think this is fantastic. And personally, I'm really looking forward to Bishop Caussé in the Quorum of the 12. I think he brings a wealth of knowledge and experience when it comes to church finances, humanitarian work, environmentalism, international experience. Professionally, he was in the food industry and he was over like a large food distribution company in France. And so he also has business executive experience. And this isn't like a career resume that like, oh, he checks all these boxes, but it shows that he does have experience dealing with difficult situations, dealing with high stress situations, which is what you're in. When you're a member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles or any general authority, you are a business executive, as Neal was saying. You're over a large organization and you've got to have both skills and experience to keep your head and to manage a lot of stress. And so, God bless Bishop Caussé. I know this is going to be, this is a huge burden. Maybe he was hoping that after he was released from being presiding bishop, he would, ride off into the sunset and have a quiet retirement. But now he is committing and consecrating the rest of his life to this specific calling. And it is a very draining calling and a very heavy mantle. But the Lord qualifies those who he calls, and the Lord lifts them up and bears them up. So I'm really excited. As one of our commenters, Dino, said, shall we not go on in so great a Caussé? I don't even know if that, I didn't deliver that line right, but I thought that was a hilarious
so
pun.
Great
well
done,
Dino.
There you go. Yeah, that's
absolutely goat level pun right there, Dino. Well done.
But I'm really looking forward to his presidency. I think it's fantastic. Any final thoughts from you guys?
Did you say apostleship? We're looking forward to his apostleship.
You're right. I should have
not
said apostleship.
presidency.
I'm sorry. Forgive me.
But yes, it'll be very exciting to see the impact he has. And obviously, we're talking about the impact he has and the skills he brings. But like you said, the Lord qualifies whom he calls. And so to be more particular about it, it'll be very interesting to see how the Lord is going to use him as an instrument in this new calling, and how the Lord is going to help take those skills and that experience that he brings and use it to further the cause of Zion, right? So,
yeah, I'll 100%. Just conclude by saying, I promise this isn't some virtue signal or thing or whatever here. I sincerely, genuinely am so happy that we have greater international representation in the Quorum of the 12. And I do, of course, believe strongly and affirm and sustain that the Lord has called these men to be his apostles. And you know what? If it was a bunch of dudes from Utah, from my neighborhood in Salt Lake City or whatever, if that's who the Lord called, I would sustain that. But I'm really happy that we're getting so much international representation from the Quorum of the 12. It really, to me, speaks to the universal message and the universal need for the gospel throughout the world, right? Through all the nations of the world. And so I'm beyond just getting a new apostle, which is always great. I'm in an extra level. I'm very happy that we have this lovely man from France who, by all accounts, is a remarkable person, and I think is going to be a great instrument in the Lord's hands to furthering his kingdom and his church. And so I'm looking forward to that. Looking forward to Onward and Upward. We'll hear from him next General Conference, right? That should be a lot of fun when we'll get to sustain him. And I am hopeful for the future in that regard.
Shall we not go on in so great a Caussé?
Oh, Caussé.
Maybe I did it better that time. Well, remember, you can always...
I was going to say, when I hear that phrase, I'm going to think of this now. Thanks a lot, Dino. That pun is going to be stuck in my head whenever I hear that line.
It is a great one. Well, remember, guys, you can study the gospel deeply but still believe boldly. Tune in next time for Informed Saints. This Sunday, we're going to have another episode coming out, and it is going to be, I'm really excited about it because it's going to be all about Are Mormons Christian? And we are interviewing a fantastic guest who is published with Eerdmans. So stay tuned for that on Sunday, and we will see you next time.